My name is Carolyn Hayes. I'm 29 years old, and I've spent most of my life believing that if you work hard, treat people with kindness, and stay true to your values, things will eventually fall into place. That's what my parents taught me back in a tiny town outside Des Moines, Iowa, a place where the church bell rings every Sunday at 10 sharp, and folks leave their front doors unlocked, trusting each other because they always have. But Asheville, North Carolina, is a different world, and nothing in my life prepared me for what was coming. I never expected to fall in love with someone like Graham Whitmore, and I definitely never expected that loving him would almost cost me everything. You see, when you love someone born into power, real, generational, old money power, you don't just love them. You inherit the scrutiny of their family, the whispers of their social circles, and the kind of judgment that doesn't come from anything you've done, but from everything you aren't. And me? I wasn't rich. I wasn't born into a family with a name engraved on city buildings. I didn't summer in the Hamptons or wear pearls passed down from grandmothers who dined with presidents. My parents couldn't give me a trust fund, only trust in myself. But none of that mattered when I met Graham. We were just two people sitting across from each other in a conference room, arguing over data points in a quarterly forecast. He was in product development at Aveline & Company. I was in corporate strategy. We disagreed over just about everything that day: how to target growth in the European market, how to position AI-integrated home systems. But he listened. He really listened. And after the meeting, he waited by the elevator and said with a crooked smile, "You were the only person who actually challenged me today. Can I buy you a coffee?" That was how it started, quietly, casually, like it always does before your life turns upside down. We kept it under wraps at first. No public dates, no office flirtation. We were careful, but when love builds slowly, it burns deeper. In late-night calls, in walks along the French Broad River, in the way he'd remember the smallest things about me, like how I hated pulp and orange juice or always carried a book in my bag. Eventually, we went public, and that's when the whispers began. "She's clearly using him to move up in the company. Isn't she from Iowa? I heard she grew up in a trailer. She's a social climber." Those weren't just careless comments. They were daggers. I started to feel it in meetings, the side eyes, the tighter smiles, the way my contributions were dismissed more often than they used to be. I had worked my way into Aveline through sheer grit. No referrals, no family connections. I passed every round of interviews and beat out Ivy League candidates with my strategy for expanding smart home furniture into underserved markets. But now, none of that seemed to matter. All they saw was a girl dating the CEO's only son. And then came the family, Julian and Vivian Whitmore. Graham's parents, the Titans. To the world, they were philanthropic icons, owners of the Aveline Empire, patrons of the arts, funders of clean water initiatives in East Africa. But to me, they were my undoing. The first time I met them was at a formal charity dinner in downtown Asheville. I wore a navy blue satin dress that I borrowed from my roommate, curled my hair to hide how nervous I was, and smiled so much my cheeks hurt. Julian shook my hand like he was gripping a dead fish. Vivian looked me up and down once and said, "Interesting shoes. Very practical." I never felt smaller in my life. Later that night, Graham whispered, "They'll come around. Just give them time." I nodded, but deep down I wasn't sure, because for people like them, time doesn't change opinion. Pedigree does. The months that followed weren't easy. At work, I kept my head down and over-delivered on every project. I pitched a strategy that helped the company avoid a disastrous partnership in Brazil. I stayed late, ran numbers, built reports that other departments relied on. But promotions eluded me. My name was skipped over. My input was acknowledged but never credited. And at every family event, the ones Graham insisted I attend, I was treated like a piece of lint on a silk dress. Vivian would ask condescending questions like, "Remind me again what you do for the company," or "Do you find corporate culture overwhelming at times?" Julian once asked if my parents had ever attended a real wine tasting. I began to question myself. Was I trying too hard? Was I even wanted? And worst of all, did Graham deserve someone easier? But he never wavered. "You're the strongest woman I know," he'd say. "You don't have to prove anything." Still, it felt like I was climbing a ladder built on glass. Then one Thursday afternoon, everything shifted. Graham called me, his voice a mix of nervousness and excitement. "They've invited you to the summer estate BBQ," he said. I froze. That wasn't just an invitation. That was a test. The Whitmore Estate BBQ wasn't a cookout. It was a gathering of titans, CEOs, foreign investors, media moguls, extended Whitmore cousins from Europe who only drank still water flown in from the Alps. It was a curated show of power, and if you were invited, you were being judged, not welcomed. And to make it even more terrifying, this year, Eleanor Whitmore, Graham's grandmother, the true matriarch of the family, would be flying in from Switzerland for the first time in 5 years. The family whispered about her like she was part legend, part monarch. She held most of the international assets. She was the only person Julian Whitmore ever deferred to. Graham smiled and said, "She's the only one who might actually give you a chance." I nodded, heart pounding. If I got this right, maybe, just maybe, I could finally be seen for who I truly was. And if I got it wrong, they'd never let me near him again. So I planned for everything. I rented a classic dress, ivory silk, timeless and understated. I polished my shoes until they gleamed. I practiced greetings in the mirror, memorized names of obscure family members from a PDF Graham sent me, and mapped out the drive down to the minute. I would be early, perfect, ready. But I wasn't ready for what actually happened. Not for the woman on the roadside, not for the rain, not for the public humiliation, and definitely not for what played on that projector screen moments later. But before I take you there, I need you to understand this. Sometimes the moment that ruins everything is the very same moment that reveals who you are. And sometimes kindness, the messy, inconvenient kind, is the very thing that brings every lie crashing down. Was I out of place? Or was I exactly where I was meant to be? If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever walked into a room where you didn't feel welcome, I want to hear your story. Comment below, share if this hit home, and don't forget to like if you've ever had to prove you're more than what they see on the surface. The next is where the storm really begins. The morning of the barbecue, I woke up before dawn, not because of excitement, because of fear. I'd gone over every detail in my mind the night before. The outfit hanging like a flag of surrender by my bedroom door. The speech I had rehearsed in case someone asked me about my background. Even the small details like where I'd park so I wouldn't look like I was arriving through the back gate. But none of that quelled the ache in my chest. What if they laugh? What if I trip? What if I don't belong? And underneath those questions lay one more terrible thought. What if they're right? That I am trying to reach too high, too far above where I was meant to be. I remembered how Vivian once said at a family charity dinner, loud enough for her friends to hear, "There's something admirable about women who know their place." They all laughed. I didn't, because I knew that laugh wasn't a joke. It was a verdict. In the weeks leading up to the party, every interaction with the Whitmores felt like a subtle kind of war. Julian's compliments came with claws. "Impressive report, Caroline. I guess not having a social life pays off." Vivian asked me over lunch once, "Do you prefer being behind the scenes, or is this all part of the plan?" "What plan?" She just smiled, sipping her wine. Graham saw it. He'd squeeze my hand under the table, furious but helpless. Because how do you fight fog? How do you defend someone against people who never say anything direct enough to call out? At work, things weren't much better. After I started dating Graham, meetings got quieter. My emails were left unread longer. My ideas were no longer discussed, just noted. The strategy I built for entering the Eastern European market was handed off to another associate to refine. That associate later presented it to the board and got promoted. I wasn't bitter. I was burning. Still, I stayed. I endured. Because walking away would have proven them right. I wanted to succeed on my own merit, and I had. But suddenly, that merit didn't matter anymore. I could feel my identity shrinking down to a label I couldn't shake. Social climber, opportunist, the girl who got lucky. My father once told me, "People will underestimate you your whole life, Caroline. You just make sure you don't underestimate yourself." But some days, I did. That morning, as I got dressed for the barbecue, I took extra time with everything. Smoothing the creases on my silk dress, adjusting the bracelet my mom gave me, checking and rechecking the GPS to make sure I'd arrive with a buffer. I was determined to be early, determined to prove, if only to myself, that I belonged. But fate doesn't care about careful plans. As I turned down a quiet road not far from the Whitmore estate, I saw her. An elderly woman standing alone on the shoulder, looking lost and cold. The first thought that ran through my head, I don't have time for this. The second, what if it was my grandmother? I pulled over, and that moment, that tiny human moment, unraveled every thread of control I had sewn into the day. "Are you okay?" I asked her through the window. She looked at me with glassy eyes. "I can't remember. My roses. I was looking for my roses." My heart twisted. She didn't know her name, couldn't remember her address. Her coat was damp, and her hands trembled as if the earth itself was too fast for her. I should have called someone. I should have kept driving. Instead, I got out of the car. "I'll help you," I said. And I did. We wandered the neighborhood. I knocked on doors. The drizzle turned into rain. My heels were soaked through. The hem of my dress turned a muddy brown. But we finally found it. Her home, nestled behind a fence overgrown with rose bushes. Her caregiver came running out in disbelief. "She wandered off again. Thank God you found her." The woman turned to me before going inside. Her voice was frail, but her words landed like a weight in my chest. "You were the only one who stopped." I nodded, too choked up to respond. And then I ran. I ran. By the time I reached the Whitmore gates, I was late. Soaked, disheveled, my hair a tangled mess, my shoes ruined, my dress stained with rain and kindness, and I knew I had failed their test, failed to impress, failed to fit into the pristine, pre-approved box they had carved out for people like me, the kind you could pat on the head but never let sit at the table. And yet, I stepped out of the car and walked in anyway, not because I believed I'd be accepted, but because I refused to walk away. The moment my heels clicked onto the marble driveway of the Whitmore estate, I felt the storm, not from the sky, but from their eyes. The estate stretched out before me like a kingdom frozen in time, towering white columns, pristine manicured gardens, laughter from somewhere behind the hedges. The scent of grilled meats and expensive perfume drifted through the air like a warning, "This is not your world." I clutched the invitation in my hand, now crumpled and damp, as if it could shield me from what I was about to face. The butler at the front entrance blinked in mild horror when he saw me. His gaze flicked down to my muddy shoes, the water stains on my dress, my wind-blown hair. He didn't smile. "Name?" he asked, monotone. "Caroline Hayes. I was invited." He checked a tablet without looking up. then picked up a phone and whispered something I couldn't hear. My stomach nodded. After a tense pause, he exhaled and opened the gate. "You may enter. Please. Try to stay off the grass." Try to stay invisible is what he really meant. I stepped through the gate and into another world. The estate lawn had been transformed into a luxury playground for the elite. Cream-colored tents housed catered buffets. Jazz floated on the air like silk. Men in pressed slacks sipped rare scotch beside women draped in Italian lace and diamonds that could pay off my student loans twice over. As I made my way toward the main gathering, conversations faltered. People turned. I could feel it. Their eyes scanning me like a security system that had flagged something out of place. Their smirks were subtle, their chuckles quiet. But their judgment? Loud enough to drown me. Is that her? She's late. Did she fall in a puddle? She drove here? How quaint! I forced a smile. I kept walking. Every step felt like I was dragging 1,000 pounds of shame behind me. I tried to smooth my hair. I dabbed at my dress with the edge of a napkin I grabbed from a passing waiter. But it was useless. No amount of dabbing could fix what I looked like to them. Out of place, out of time, out of her mind for showing up. I scanned the crowd, searching for Graham. He was at the main table near the stage, speaking to his cousin. When he saw me, his expression shifted in a split second, from confusion to concern to panic. He rushed toward me. "Caroline, what happened?" His voice was low, desperate, as if trying to protect me from the glares he already knew were landing. I pulled him aside and whispered fast, trying to keep my voice steady. There was an elderly woman on the road. She was lost. She couldn't remember where she lived. She needed help. He looked at me, eyes wide, trying to absorb it all. Then, before he could say anything more, the air shifted. Julian Whitmore had seen me. He stood from the head table like a judge rising in court. "Caroline Hayes," he said loudly. Conversation ceased. Music paused. All eyes snapped toward me. I froze. Graham stepped in front of me, but Julian raised a hand. "She can speak for herself," he said. His voice was calm, too calm. It was the stillness before a hurricane. I stepped forward, my throat dry. "I'm sorry I'm late, Mr. Whitmore. I encountered someone on the way." He cut me off with a wave. "You're late. You're drenched. You look like you just climbed out of a sewer." Someone laughed. Was the invitation unclear? It said formal attire. It said 3:00 p.m. sharp. Not whenever you please, and certainly not looking like that. I felt my ears burn. My cheeks prickled with heat. I opened my mouth to speak, but he didn't stop. "You see, ladies and gentlemen," he continued, addressing the entire crowd, "this is what we're dealing with. My son Graham, a promising executive in our company, has chosen to bring this into our home." More murmurs. She doesn't respect our traditions. She doesn't respect our time. And apparently, she doesn't even respect herself. Graham stepped beside me, his voice sharp. "That's enough." Julian didn't blink. "No, son, this is just beginning. Because your choices reflect on this family. And this reflects very poorly." My heart thudded in my chest like a drumbeat of humiliation. I could feel my eyes welling with tears, but I refused to let them fall. Vivian stood beside her husband, arms crossed, gaze like frost. She didn't say a word, but her silence screamed, "You'll never be one of us." I wanted to leave, run, hide, but something deeper inside me, something forged in every late-night study session, every rejection letter, every backhanded compliment I'd ever received, made me stand tall. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice quivering but clear, "but I did what I thought was right." Julian raised a brow. By showing up here as a walking disaster? No, I said, louder now. By helping someone who needed me. Silence, tense, cracking. Then Julian scoffed. A convenient story. It's the truth, I replied. And in that moment, I saw it in his eyes. He didn't care. Because no matter what I said, I wasn't going to be enough. Not for this family, not for this world. And that's when I realized this wasn't just a social test. This was a trap. I had walked into the lion's den, and the lions weren't even trying to hide their teeth anymore. I stood there, soaked, humiliated, and exposed like a misfit prop on the Whitmore stage, every eye still pinned to me, as if waiting for the final blow to land. But none of them expected what happened next, because just when the silence thickened, just when I thought even the earth beneath me was about to swallow me whole, I felt a hand slip quietly into mine. Graham. No grand gesture, no heroic speech, just his fingers curling gently around mine in front of all of them. I believe her, he said, his voice quiet but resolute. And if helping someone makes her unwelcome here, maybe I'm in the wrong place too. Julian's expression didn't change, but his jaw twitched, the first crack in the mask. Vivian blinked once, her lips parting slightly. She looked at Graham as if he were a stranger, and then someone else spoke. She's not the one who looks disgraceful right now. Every head turned, even mine. The voice had come from behind the wine bar, a calm, crisp tone wrapped in an unmistakable European accent. Eleanor Whitmore. She stood there in a long dove-gray coat, pearls resting on her collarbone, silver hair swept into a chignon so elegant it belonged in a painting. I hadn't even realized she had arrived, but somehow she had seen everything. Julian stiffened. Mother, you're early. Her eyes cut to him like knives wrapped in silk. Clearly just in time. There was a murmur in the crowd. Even the servers paused. The woman I had heard so much about, the true power in the Whitmore dynasty, slowly walked toward the center of the gathering. No one dared stop her, not even Julian. Eleanor looked at me with sharp, unreadable eyes. Her gaze scanned my hair, my mud-stained dress, my trembling fingers. And then she did the most unexpected thing. She smiled. Not a pitying smile, not a condescending one, a real one, warm, direct. She stepped beside me and turned to the crowd. This young woman helped someone in need, she said. She sacrificed her appearance, her timing, and her comfort for the sake of a stranger. Then her eyes flicked back to Julian. Tell me, son, when was the last time you did something for someone who had nothing to offer in return? Julian's lips pressed into a line. The question hung there, unanswered. Vivian looked away. Someone in the back coughed awkwardly, but Eleanor wasn't finished. I came here today expecting to be introduced to the woman Graham has chosen. I didn't expect to witness a public flogging, nor did I expect to see my family, the one I've spent my life building, behave like a country club jury, deciding who gets to exist. Her words were soft, but every syllable landed like a gavel. I couldn't breathe, because I knew what this was. This wasn't just support. It was protection. Eleanor Whitmore, the matriarch, was standing beside me, defending me. And yet, part of me didn't understand why. How? She barely knew me, or so I thought. Then she turned slightly, just enough for only Graham and me to hear. I've been watching, listening. I wanted to see with my own eyes. I stared at her. What did she mean? She smiled again, smaller this time, almost mischievous. It's the quiet ones who reveal the most. Then she pivoted back toward the crowd. "Now," she said, clapping once, "let's stop this nonsense. Someone get her a dry coat and let's eat. I came here for ribs, not a character assassination." A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the guests. The tension eased, though some eyes still lingered too long on me. But the energy had shifted, because Eleanor had spoken, and in this family, when she spoke, everyone listened. Except Julian. I caught him stepping aside, speaking low and fast into his phone. His gaze flicked back to me more than once, his jaw clenched tight. Whatever he was plotting, I could feel it brewing beneath the surface. But I didn't care. Not in that moment. Because I'd been given something rarer than praise. I'd been given space, a chance to stay, a seat at the table, even if it was temporary. One of the servers brought me a fresh coat. Someone else offered me napkins. Graham led me gently toward a smaller table near the main one, where I could sit down, dry off, and pretend, if only for a little while, that I wasn't still unraveling on the inside. "Are you okay?" he whispered, placing a warm hand on the small of my back. I nodded, tears threatening again. "I don't know why she stood up for me." He smiled. "Because she sees you." And that single sentence, that one line, hit harder than any insult I had heard all day, because that's all I ever wanted. To be seen, not as a project, not as a liability, not as a social climber, but as me. Caroline, the girl from Iowa, the woman who built her life from scratch, the strategist, the human being who stopped her car that day because her parents raised her right. And in that moment, I knew, no matter how this day ended, I wasn't going back to who I was before it began. I had crossed a line, not into their world, but into my own, a place where I could exist without apology. And though the battle wasn't over, for the first time in months, I felt like I had a weapon of my own. The rest of the afternoon passed like a strange, slow-motion ballet. People moving around me, pretending everything was fine, while I sat in a borrowed coat, half invisible, half infamous. The sting from Julian's words hadn't faded, and though Eleanor's intervention had stopped the bleeding, the wound was still there, pulsing just beneath my skin. Vivian never spoke to me directly again that day. She floated through the crowd like smoke, trailing power behind her, pausing only to whisper into the ears of distant cousins and investment partners, never once letting her eyes meet mine. I could feel what she was doing, reinforcing her narrative. She's playing the victim. She knew Eleanor would show up. Pity points. Smart move. They thought I couldn't hear them, but I heard everything. Because once you've been labeled a climber, every kindness you receive is seen as strategy. Every act of grace becomes manipulation, and every bit of success is treated like theft. Still, I stayed. I stayed through the awkward introductions, the stiff, cold handshakes, the women who smiled too wide and then turned away before I could respond. I ate only a few bites of food. My appetite was gone. My mind was spinning. I kept replaying that moment when Julian humiliated me, how easy it was for him to strip me bare in front of everyone, how confidently he weaponized my appearance, my background, my values. But I also kept replaying Eleanor's words. "Tell me, son, when was the last time you did something for someone who had nothing to offer in return?" And suddenly, I saw it. He was scared. Julian Whitmore, the man who ruled boardrooms and intimidated senators, was afraid of one thing: someone like me with nothing to lose and nothing to hide. Because that's what real power looks like. It doesn't scream, it doesn't have to. It's the quiet conviction that you've already survived worse, that no dinner party insult or dripping sarcasm can erase the fact that you stood in the rain for someone who couldn't remember their own name, and you did it without hesitation. That's something his money couldn't buy. That's something his name couldn't command. And deep down, he knew it. I could feel him watching me from across the lawn, speaking with Eleanor's attorney, no doubt calculating his next move. The BBQ wrapped up just after sunset. Lanterns flickered to life, casting warm light over champagne glasses and conversations that had drifted from gossip to business. But I was done pretending. I walked with Graham toward the edge of the estate, where the valet was retrieving cars. The gravel path crunched beneath our feet. He hadn't let go of my hand once since Eleanor's speech. And yet, I sensed something shifting in him too. He was proud, protective, but also conflicted. When we reached the edge of the lawn, he turned to me. "I wish I could fix this." "You can't," I said quietly. "It's not yours to fix." He looked away, and for a moment, I thought he might say something else, something heavy. But he didn't. Instead, he leaned in and kissed my forehead, a gesture both tender and uncertain. "I'm here," he whispered. But I couldn't help wondering, for how long? We drove home in silence. The windshield wipers ticked like a metronome, keeping time with my heartbeat. Graham kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting on my knee. But neither of us spoke. There was nothing left to say. Not yet. When we reached my apartment, I got out without asking him to come up. He didn't argue. "Call me," he said, lingering at the door. I nodded. He waited until I was safely inside before pulling away, a habit he'd kept since our very first date. But something felt different now. Something felt like it was about to break. I peeled off the soaked coat, slipped out of my ruined heels, and sat on the floor of my kitchen. My dress was still wet, sticking to my skin, but I didn't care. I needed stillness. I needed silence. And I needed to remember who I was before they tried to tell me who I wasn't. So I lit a candle. Just one. The kind my mother used to keep in the kitchen during thunderstorms. And I pulled out a small leather notebook, the one I kept tucked behind my bookshelf, filled with business plans I'd never dared pitch, ideas for impact-driven consulting firms, nonprofit mergers, microfinance networks for women-owned startups. All the dreams I had put on pause to play the part I thought would make them accept me. I stared at those pages for a long time, and then I began to write again. Not because I had a plan, but because I had finally reached a point where I wasn't afraid to be seen as too much, too ambitious, too opinionated, too different. I wasn't going to shrink anymore. Let them talk. Let them whisper. Let them roll their eyes behind my back and call me calculating. I would let my life, my truth, be louder than all of it. Because I hadn't just passed Eleanor Whitmore's test, I had passed my own. And if they thought that afternoon was the end of my story, they hadn't seen anything yet. 2 weeks passed. 2 painfully quiet, heavy weeks after the infamous Whitmore barbecue, the one where I had been publicly shamed, then unexpectedly rescued by the family's iron-fisted matriarch. But while the rest of the Whitmore clan may have tried to pretend nothing had happened, smiling at me during brief encounters in the hallways at Aveline HQ or offering tight, forced good mornings in elevators, I hadn't forgotten. Not the laughter, not the silence, and not the humiliation that made my soul want to disappear into the earth. I was no longer bleeding, but I hadn't healed either. I'd gone back to work like everything was normal, showing up early, staying late, completing deliverables with ruthless efficiency, because that was something I could control. But Graham had changed too. He was still kind, still present, but there was a hesitance in his voice now, a cautious softness whenever he brought up his parents, or worse, his grandmother. It was like he knew something he couldn't say yet, something that made him worry for me. I asked him once if everything was okay. He nodded, kissed my temple, and said, "Just Complicated. That word, complicated, hung over me like smoke. Then, one Tuesday morning, while I was neck-deep in a proposal for an eco-conscious modular line, I received an internal calendar invite. Meeting, Whitmore Foundation Board, confidential briefing time, 3:00 p.m. Location, 38th floor, executive boardroom. I blinked. I wasn't supposed to be on the 38th floor. That was the family's domain, Julian's, Vivian's, Eleanor's, a place where decisions were made behind polished oak doors and guarded by silence. I texted Graham. Me. Did you see this invite? Was it sent by mistake? Graham. No mistake. Just trust me. Go. That was it. No warning. No explanation. Just that vague, suffocating phrase again. Trust me. At 2:57 p.m., I stood outside the boardroom, pulse tapping against my ribs like a trapped bird. My heels, modest black pumps, felt like stilts. My blouse, ivory silk, stuck slightly to the small of my back from nerves. When I walked in, the room went still. Eleanor was seated at the head of the table, her cane resting against her chair like a sword. Julian sat stiffly to her right, arms crossed. Vivian was beside him, flipping through a leather-bound agenda she clearly wasn't reading. Graham wasn't there. Neither was anyone from the traditional board, just family and me. Caroline, Eleanor said, gesturing to the seat across from her. Come in, sit. I obeyed, carefully placing my folder on the table, unsure whether to speak or wait. You've been working on the solstice line, she said, getting straight to the point. We've been following your progress. My throat tightened. Yes, ma'am. I've been leading the strategy team on sustainable market integration. She nodded slowly, as if evaluating not just my words, but the energy behind them. Julian didn't look at me. Vivian smiled, but it didn't touch her eyes. Tell me, Eleanor continued, why do you think we should expand into modular furniture markets in Central America? The question caught me off guard. It wasn't a test of loyalty. It was a pitch. My fingers found the edge of my folder, and I opened my mouth, prepared to regurgitate numbers and projections, but stopped. They already knew the numbers. What they didn't know, or didn't expect from me, was heart. So I gave them that. I looked Eleanor dead in the eye and said, because modular furniture is about dignity, about offering flexibility and self-expression to people who've historically only had scraps. When a single mother in Costa Rica can choose how to configure her own space within her means, we're not just selling her furniture, we're offering her control. Eleanor blinked slowly. Julian shifted in his chair. I kept going. We're entering a new era. People don't want to be impressed by wealth anymore. They want to see companies that understand the value of enough. If Aveline gets ahead of that curve with authenticity, we lead the narrative. We don't follow it. For a moment, the room was still, and then Eleanor leaned back in her chair, a ghost of a grin tugging at her lips. Well then, she said, you're ready. My breath hitched. Ready? For what? Vivian spoke next, voice like iced champagne. To lead the pilot for the Solstice Global Initiative, she said flatly. Eleanor wants it launched under her name and under your direction. I sat frozen, stunned. This was massive. A global pilot, under Eleanor's name, with me in the lead. But why? Why me? Julian finally looked at me then, and his gaze wasn't just cold, it was full of quiet fury. You've made quite the impression, he said. Enjoy it while it lasts. His words were clipped, bitter, and that's when I understood. This wasn't just an opportunity, it was a power play. Eleanor was handing me a sword, and she wanted to see what I'd do with it. After the boardroom meeting, I sat alone in my car for nearly half an hour, staring at the dashboard, the words, "You're ready," echoing again and again inside my skull. Not because I didn't believe it, but because they did. Eleanor Whitmore, the most powerful woman I had ever stood before, hadn't just defended me publicly. She had handed me a seat at the table. Her table. And Julian? He had looked at me with the kind of cold restraint that men like him reserved for enemies they couldn't control. It wasn't a promotion. It was provocation. He hadn't thrown me out. He had thrown me into the arena, where he assumed I'd eventually crumble under the pressure of being the outsider, the imposter, the girl who came from nothing and now carried something too big for her hands. But he had underestimated one thing. I had been carrying pressure my whole life. I wasn't just ready, I was hungry. The next morning, a press release hit every major business outlet. Whitmore Matriarch appoints Caroline Hayes to spearhead global initiative. The words, "from rural Iowa to global markets," were quoted more than once. There were interviews, internal applause. Aveline's PR team tried to spin it as a bold embrace of diversity and innovation. I knew better. It was a calculated move, and I was the symbol they had chosen. A symbol, or a time bomb. Still, I smiled for the cameras. I answered every journalist with grace, every whisper in the hallways with silence, and every congratulation from people who once ignored me with nothing more than a professional nod. But behind closed doors, I was working, harder than I ever had. I built a launch strategy with airtight budgets, regional partnerships, sustainability benchmarks, and a logistics pipeline that made our COO blink in disbelief. I handpicked a lean team of underutilized talent from across departments. People just like me who had been overlooked, labeled not quite Aveline material. They weren't just my team, they were my statement. Meanwhile, Graham watched it all unfold, like a man caught between two tectonic plates. He was proud, yes, but also restless. His parents had begun making veiled comments at dinners. His mother would sigh and say, "It's wonderful how eager Caroline is to prove herself." His father? Just silence, cold and immovable. One night, Graham sat on my couch, glass of wine untouched. "Do you trust her?" he asked suddenly. "Eleanor?" He nodded. "She gave me this chance," I said. "She believed in me." Graham looked at me for a long time. "No," he said. "She chose you. That's not the same." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying be careful. In our family, power always has strings. And Eleanor, she pulls them better than anyone." That stuck with me, because even though I wanted to believe her support was pure, I knew better. I hadn't gotten here on accident, and I hadn't been brought into that boardroom because they suddenly saw my heart. I was a weapon, a tool in a war I hadn't asked to fight. But here's the thing they didn't count on. I wasn't just their pawn. I was learning, watching, calculating. And most importantly, I had the one thing none of them had: authenticity. People believed in me because I hadn't changed to fit the room. I had made the room shift for me, and that shift was becoming visible. At the next company-wide quarterly meeting, Eleanor invited me to present the Solstice Initiative publicly. It was rare for her to attend these meetings, let alone speak. Even rarer to hand the stage to someone not bearing the Whitmore name. I stepped onto that platform in a tailored navy suit, clean lines, no frills, and looked out over the room of executives, partners, and board members. I didn't start with data. I started with story. I grew up in a town where modular furniture meant milk crates and hope, I said. My mother taught in a public school where the desks were held together with duct tape. My father fixed tractors for farmers who paid him in produce when they couldn't afford cash. So when I say I believe in design that empowers, it's not theory, it's personal. You could hear the silence thicken. Solstice isn't just a product line, it's a commitment to building dignity into the everyday lives of people who've long been overlooked. And we're not just entering a market, we're meeting it with open hands. I laid out the framework, clean, bulletproof, but laced with heart. When I finished, the applause was slow, but then it grew. Even Julian, seated in the front row beside Eleanor, had to nod politely. But his eyes? They burned. Later that day, I received an internal email. Anonymous. Be careful where you stand. The light shines hot, but shadows move faster. I deleted it, but I didn't forget it, because that meant one thing. They were watching me, all of them. And something was coming, something big. I just didn't know what yet. The ballroom was bathed in soft amber light. Crystal chandeliers dangled above white linen tables like frozen fireworks. Murmurs of wealth, ambition, and politics hummed beneath the clinking of glasses and the muted jazz floating from the corner stage. This wasn't just a gala. It was the gala, the annual Aveline Foundation charity dinner, the one event every year that brought together CEOs, senators, investors, and socialites under one roof, all of them eager to see who stood closest to the Whitmore family spotlight. I had been invited before, always at the fringe, never at the head table. But this year, I was the keynote speaker. Not just because I led a globally praised initiative, not just because Eleanor had publicly backed me, but because somehow I had become a symbol of the new era Aveline was trying to brand: ethical, young, progressive, grounded. Of course, the irony wasn't lost on me. I hadn't been chosen because they loved me. I'd been chosen because I worked, because I looked good for the press, because Eleanor, brilliant as ever, knew what made a brand appear human wasn't the elite. It was the outlier. And I was the perfect outlier. Rural roots, rags to recognition, the girl who helped a lost old woman on the roadside. Except not everyone thought I deserved the microphone. I could feel it in the way Julian never once made eye contact with me the entire evening, in the way Vivian smiled just a little too tightly as she introduced herself to reporters, and especially in the way Graham sat silently next to his father, his expression unreadable, his wine untouched. Something was off. I just didn't know what. Not until it happened. The speech was going well. I'd written it myself, a blend of sincerity, strategy, and just enough humility to silence any lingering doubts about my intentions. I spoke about design as a form of compassion, about how sustainability wasn't just for headlines, but for dignity, about why the future of furniture had to be about people, not just profit. And the audience was eating it up. Even the most hardened billionaires nodded. I felt it. This moment, this power. I wasn't just being heard. I was being felt. But then came the moment when everything shifted. The screen behind me, which had been displaying slides from the Solstice Initiative, suddenly blinked. There was no warning, just a glitch. Then a pause. Then a video. It wasn't in the program, and I didn't press play. But there it was, suddenly casting itself across the 20-foot projection screen behind me. It started with rain, gray skies, mud, a woman on the roadside, frail, lost, frightened, and then me, getting out of my car, wrapping her in my coat, holding her hand, leading her through puddles, speaking calmly, smiling gently, kneeling beside her to tie her shoe as the rain soaked through my silk dress. Gasps rippled through the crowd. They remembered. This was the infamous day, The day I arrived late and muddy to the Whitmore BBQ, the day Julian nearly tore me apart in front of 200 guests, the screen cut to the moment I entered the party, soaked, fragile, and Julian's voice echoed through the ballroom. "Miss Hayes, is this the respect you show our family?" It was all there, everything he'd said. Every icy syllable, louder now, played over speakers, on record. The entire room turned to stare, not at me, but at him. Then came Eleanor's voice, sharper than thunder. "This woman helped someone in need." I turned around. I wasn't speaking anymore. I didn't have to. The footage did everything. Because then, the final twist. The old woman from the roadside was Eleanor, disguised. Her hair loosened, no makeup, worn coat, and her words from that day echoed now, louder than before. She didn't know I was Eleanor Whitmore. She only knew I was lost. A single moment, a single sentence, and the room changed. Julian paled. Vivian froze. Reporters looked at each other in shock, some already typing furiously into phones. The projection faded. The lights returned. Silence. Then, applause. It started from the back, scattered, unsure, then louder, growing. Eleanor rose from her seat and walked slowly toward the stage. She took the mic from my hand, gently, like a passing of a torch, and then she spoke. "This," she said, gesturing to the now dark screen behind us, "is why I chose Caroline Hayes. Not approved of, not tolerated, chose. Because character cannot be inherited. It is revealed, usually when no one is watching." Her eyes swept over the room, and Julian was watching. He saw kindness and turned it into condemnation. Every eye snapped to him. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He had already said enough, on the screen, for the world to see. Eleanor placed a hand on my shoulder and leaned close to the mic. "Caroline, darling, thank you for reminding this family who we used to be." Thunderous applause. I stood there, no longer trembling, no longer invisible. I had become the mirror that exposed the cracks in their legacy. And they, the ones who had laughed, whispered, judged, now looked at me with something entirely new. Respect. Not because I demanded it, but because they had no choice. Because now, the world had seen, and the story they had tried to bury had just gone viral. The morning after the gala, the news cycle detonated like a live wire thrown into a pool of oil. I didn't even have to check the headlines. They found me. Whitmore heiress humiliated. Video shows billionaire patriarch publicly shaming woman who helped his own mother. The Caroline Hayes effect. From Iowa, nobody to corporate game changer. Eleanor Whitmore orchestrates family test. Only one passes. By noon, my inbox had collapsed. Requests for interviews. Invites to speak at women's summits, equity conferences, even a Harvard guest panel. People I hadn't spoken to in years messaged me like we were old friends. "You were always destined for this. I always knew you had something special." Lies. And I didn't respond to any of them. Because while the world was marveling at my rise, inside the Whitmore dynasty, something was breaking, and I could feel it. It started with the silence. No calls from Julian, no texts from Vivian. Even Graham, who'd once been my daily rhythm, had gone quiet. Not cold, just cautious. When he finally did call, his voice was strained. "You okay?" "I'm fine," I said, though we both knew I wasn't talking about health. He exhaled. "Dad's furious. He's calling it a setup." I paused. "A setup? You mean the footage?" "He says it was edited, twisted, that you and Eleanor planned it all." I let that hang in the air. "Did we?" I asked. Graham didn't answer right away. Then, "I don't think it matters anymore. The damage is done." He was right, because while Eleanor's support had lifted me, it had toppled him. Julian Whitmore, untouchable for decades, was now the face of elitist cruelty. Stock prices hadn't dropped, but public perception had. Aveline's social media feeds were flooded with comments demanding an apology. Influencers who had once flaunted Whitmore furniture now avoided tagging the brand. Even inside the company, people whispered openly about the shift. Some employees started stopping me in hallways. "Thank you for standing there. You said what we all feel." "I've been here 5 years. No one's ever looked at me the way Eleanor looked at you." They meant it as encouragement. But I felt the weight in those words, because I had become more than a strategist. I had become a symbol, and symbols come with consequences. 2 weeks later, I received a formal invitation, delivered by courier, a dinner at the Whitmore estate. The note was handwritten. "Caroline, join us." Julian. Just 3 words. But behind them, volumes. Graham called that afternoon. He asked me not to come, said it should just be you and them. "So it's an ambush?" "I don't know, but go." "Why?" He hesitated. "Because if you don't, you'll never know what they're really afraid of." So I went. Not because I wanted closure, but because I wanted confirmation. I arrived at dusk. Same gravel drive, same guarded gates, same cold classical mansion looming like a marble monument to ego. Vivian greeted me at the door. Her smile was polite, polished, plastic. "You look well," she said. "You look surprised." A flicker of something, irritation, amusement, passed through her eyes. We dined in the smaller salon, a room I had never been invited into before. It was dim, too quiet, and smelled faintly of lemon polish and antique wood. Julian sat at the head of the table, as always. Eleanor was not there. We ate in silence for 5 long minutes. Then he finally spoke. "You've humiliated me." I didn't blink. "No, you did that yourself." Vivian stirred her wine. "Do you really think Eleanor's blessing makes you untouchable?" I looked her in the eye. "No, but it makes me visible, and that's all I ever needed." Julian set down his fork. "You think you've won something, that this attention will last. But legacy doesn't bend for moments. It swallows them." And there it was, the threat behind the politeness, the warning behind the wine. I smiled. "I'm not here for your legacy." I stood. "I'm here for your future, and you can either fight it or you can get out of its way." I walked out without dessert, and that was the last time I saw Julian Whitmore inside his own house, because 3 days later, he stepped down. Officially, it was to refocus on philanthropic endeavors. But everyone knew the truth. A throne that once seemed carved from stone had been shattered by a screen and a storm, and the girl they called a social climber, she hadn't climbed, she'd been dragged in and left standing when the empire cracked. The day after Julian's resignation, the office buzzed with an energy that felt less like celebration and more like disbelief. No one said his name. No one had to. The tension that had lived in the air like thick fog, the fear that every decision was a test of loyalty to a man whose smile never reached his eyes, was suddenly gone. There were long exhalations in break rooms, cautious grins exchanged in elevators. A few people even wore color again, as if mourning a culture that had quietly oppressed them without ever writing it into the handbook. And me? I walked into the 38th floor for the first time as someone not just invited, but expected. It felt wrong, not because I didn't earn it, but because the victory felt colder than I imagined. Julian was gone, the throne was empty, but the palace still stood. And power has a way of reshaping itself, shifting from person to person like smoke seeking new lungs. Vivian was already taking more meetings. She had returned to her sharp navy blazers and rose gold jewelry, her armor, and sat in on the executive weekly huddle as if she hadn't spent the last year dismissing every one of my reports. She didn't speak to me directly, but I felt her eyes on me every time I spoke. She was calculating, studying, waiting. I wasn't afraid, but I wasn't foolish either. Graham finally called again that evening. "Can I come over?" he asked. I hesitated. Of course. When he arrived, he was carrying a brown paper bag of Thai food, our comfort meal. He set it down, didn't kiss me, just stood there in the doorway like a man caught between two burning houses. "I'm proud of you," he said, but his voice was hollow. "You don't sound like it." He rubbed his face, frustrated, "Because it doesn't feel like a win." I crossed my arms. "Then what does it feel like, Graham? Your father tried to ruin me, in public. And when the truth came out, he got a retirement press release." "I know," he said softer, "but you changed everything. And now I don't know where I stand anymore." That stopped me. I sat down slowly. "Tell me the truth. Did you ever think I planned it? The video? Eleanor? All of it?" He didn't answer right away. And that silence, that 2-second delay, cracked something I hadn't even realized was fragile inside me. "You did," I said. "At least part of you did." "It's not that I don't trust you," he said quickly. "It's that I know my family. I know what Eleanor is capable of. And I don't know where you begin and she ends anymore." I stared at him. The man who had once told me I was the strongest woman he'd ever met now looked at me like I was a stranger with too much light. I rose. "Graham," I said gently, "you loved me when I was fighting for a seat. Do you still love me now that I've taken one?" He looked up. His eyes said yes. His silence said, "I don't know." And I knew then something had shifted, not just in our dynamic, but in our story. We had been born in fire, bound together by defiance. But now I wasn't fighting anymore. I was leading, and he wasn't ready for that. The following week, I received an internal memo. Vivienne would be overseeing strategic realignments across departments. I was asked to present updates from the Solstice Initiative directly to her office every Friday. It was positioned as support, but I knew what it was: surveillance. Eleanor, meanwhile, had gone radio silent. She'd left for Zurich to rest, leaving behind a dozen empty chairs and a room of predators who were already circling the next opportunity. But I didn't flinch. I doubled down. I added new data pipelines to the initiative. I built out a mentorship program to pull junior staff from overlooked backgrounds into executive visibility tracks. I made the foundation of this empire wider, so if it ever crumbled again, more people would walk away standing. Still, at night, when the headlines faded and the applause dimmed, I felt it. The chill, the silence that comes when you finally win and realize how few people ever wanted you to, the weight of being right, the grief of having no one left to prove it to. But I didn't regret it, not for a second. Because when you fight for the truth, And the truth stands, you don't owe the silence anything, not even your sadness. You owe it only your fire. And I still had plenty of that left. The final move didn't come with drama. It came in an envelope, a pale ivory one, thick, sealed with gold wax and embossed with the Whitmore crest. It arrived on a rainy Thursday morning, slid beneath my apartment door like a ghost with perfect timing. Inside, a single sheet of stationery, handwritten in Vivian's meticulous calligraphy. Caroline, we've watched your rise. We respect your results, but power without humility burns its bearer. The family invites you to remember that. V. I read it once, then again. I knew what it was. Not a threat. A prophecy. She wasn't attacking me. She was warning me. And that was worse, because it meant she no longer saw me as a girl clawing for status. She saw me as someone capable of holding it. But it also meant she believed I would lose it, that she was waiting, patiently, elegantly, for me to fall. And that kind of enemy, the one who smiles and waits, is the most dangerous kind. At the office, things shifted subtly. My Friday meetings with Vivian became colder, sharper, her questions more pointed. So this inclusion metric, does it actually translate to profit? Your projections are optimistic. Are you willing to stake your role on them? I didn't flinch. I had built every chart, knew every line item. My hands were deep in the soil of this project, and she could dig all she wanted. But the message was clear. She was probing, looking for a crack, a weakness. And the truth? I was starting to feel them, not in the data, in myself. I was tired, the kind of tired that doesn't sleep off, the kind of tired that settles behind your ribs like a stone, heavy and unmoving, because rising was one kind of battle. Staying there was a war of its own. Every meeting I walked into, I had to prove I wasn't lucky. Every strategy I proposed had to be 3 times stronger than anyone else's. Every time I smiled, I had to be careful it didn't look smug. Every time I frowned, I had to make sure it didn't look emotional. I was too visible to be human anymore. And invisibility, the very thing I used to fight against, had started to look like peace. Graham and I had dinner one last time. We didn't plan for it to be the last. We met at the quiet Italian bistro we used to sneak into before anyone at Aveline knew we were together. Same booth, same wine, but nothing else was the same. He looked older, not in his face, in his spirit. "You've changed," he said, halfway through the appetizer. I stared at him. "No," I said. "I arrived. That's different." He nodded slowly. "Maybe. Or maybe you just finally became who you were always going to be." We ate in silence, and then, without needing to speak it, we both knew it was over. He kissed my cheek at the curb. "Tell them the truth, always," he whispered, "even when they hate you for it." I nodded. "Stay kind," I whispered back, "even when they don't deserve it." And he walked away. Not bitter, not angry, just done, like a chapter closing itself. Eleanor returned from Zurich the following week. She summoned me to the rooftop garden. I found her seated beneath a pergola of ivy, sipping espresso from a cup that looked like it belonged in a museum. She didn't rise, just nodded to the seat across from her. "You did well," she said. "I survived," I replied. She smiled faintly. "Same thing in this world." There was a pause. Then she asked, "Are you tired yet?" I stared at her. "Yes." She nodded. "Good. That means you're paying attention." I waited for the offer. The next step, the seat on the board, the keys to the kingdom. But it didn't come. Instead, she set her cup down and said, "Walk away while it's still yours." My throat caught. "Excuse me? You've already made your mark. If you stay too long, they'll turn your story into a cautionary tale." "But I haven't finished." "Exactly," she cut in. "That's when you leave, before they crown you, and then use that crown to weigh you down." It hit me like a cold wind. She wasn't offering me more. She was giving me an exit, a dignified one most people never get. I took it. Not right away, but 3 weeks later, I submitted my transition plan, effective immediately after the Solstice launch in Q1. People were shocked, some confused, some called it impulsive, some, like Vivian, called it strategic. And maybe it was, but mostly it was mercy. For myself. Because I had proved everything I needed to. I didn't need their table anymore. I'd already built my own. And I was ready to sit at it, alone if I had to, with peace instead of permission. On my final day at Aveline, no one threw a party. There were no farewell banners or celebratory cupcakes. No emails with subject lines like, "We'll miss you, Caroline," or "Farewell to a star." And that was exactly how I wanted it. Because when you leave a kingdom, you were never meant to inherit. You don't walk out with a parade. You walk out like a shadow, clean, calm, and completely untouchable. I submitted my final reports, shook hands with the 3 people who mattered most to me, and left through the side door, the one no one ever noticed unless they were looking. It was the same door I used on my first day, back when no one knew my name. The symmetry felt right. Outside, the city was bustling, unbothered. I hailed a cab, no chauffeur this time, and told the driver to take me home. And as we moved through the streets of Asheville, I looked out at the people on the sidewalks, some dressed like money, some dragging bags bigger than their bodies, all of them moving, surviving, trying. And I felt peace. Not the performative kind, the real kind, the kind that creeps up your spine when you finally realize no one owns your name anymore. Not the press, not the board, not the family whose surname once tried to swallow you whole. No one. I spent the next month doing what I hadn't done in years, being still. I read novels, not business books, stories. Ones that made me cry and laugh and remember that I wasn't just a strategist, but a woman who once dreamed of writing her own. I walked to the local bakery every morning, not because I needed bread, but because the old man behind the counter told me stories of his late wife with a softness that made the world slow down. I painted, badly, but freely. And I stopped answering calls that began with, "We'd love to feature your journey," or "Can we book you for a TEDx?" Not because I didn't appreciate the attention, but because I was no longer interested in being a moment. I wanted to be a life. Then, one morning, a letter arrived. Not email, not DM, a letter from Eleanor. Her handwriting was shakier this time, but the words were still sharp as ever. "Caroline, some people are remembered for how they stood in the spotlight. You, I suspect, will be remembered for how you walked away from it. That's rarer. That's power. And that's peace. Enjoy it. You've earned more than they'll ever understand. E." I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer beside my bed. I didn't need to frame it. I didn't need to post it. Just knowing it existed was enough. Because that was the final truth they could never take from me. I didn't just survive them, I outgrew them. And when a woman walks away, not because she lost, but because she's done proving she never had to fight in the first place, that's not retreat. That's arrival. Months passed, quietly, without incident, without headlines. My name slowly faded from trending topics, from boardroom whispers, from the breathless speculation of LinkedIn commentators who had once spun entire podcasts around the rise of the Iowa girl in heels. And that, too, was part of the healing. Because when you're no longer breaking into someone else's legacy, you finally have space to build your own. I moved. Nothing dramatic, just to a smaller place with better light, closer to the river, farther from downtown towers that had once defined how high I thought I had to climb. I launched something new, not a company, a program, Design with Dignity. We partnered with public schools and women's shelters to build modular spaces that adapted to trauma, healing, and hope. It wasn't about the furniture. It was about what the furniture allowed people to imagine again. I didn't attach my face to it. There were no personal logos, no TED-style promo reels, only impact, only stories, and they were enough. Then one morning, while sipping coffee in the park near my new home, I saw her, Vivian. Not dressed in power navy this time, but in a pale trench coat, sunglasses, and heels that still clicked with authority even on cobblestone. She hadn't seen me yet. She was walking with another woman, younger, perhaps a mentee. Their conversation was low, but I could hear just enough. "This space was designed by Hayes's initiative," Vivian was saying, gesturing to the open modular library near the community garden. "Innovative, simple, surprisingly enduring." The younger woman smiled. "Did you ever work with her?" Vivian paused, long enough for the pause to say something. Then, briefly, "She didn't stay in our world long." "But she left a mark?" Another pause. Vivian nodded slowly. "She left a reminder." And that was it. No credit, no warmth, but no dismissal either. Because even Vivian, with all her elegance and curated composure, couldn't deny it anymore. I hadn't disappeared. I had settled into something truer, deeper, and that unsettled people like her more than any headline ever could. A few days later, I received a forwarded newsletter, the Whitmore Foundation Quarterly Update. Buried halfway through the publication was a photo of a new overseas initiative in partnership with a South American relief project. In the caption, "Inspired by the principles pioneered in the Solstice Global Model designed by former Abilene strategist Caroline Hayes." No flourish, no glowing bio, just that one sentence. And that was all I needed, because that's what real legacy looks like, not applause, echo. I saw Graham once more, at a wedding, not ours, not even close. He was across the reception hall, standing beside a woman I didn't recognize. Her hand looped gently around his arm, the kind of touch that didn't need proving. We locked eyes only once, and in that glance, there was no pain, no longing, just memory. He lifted his glass slightly. I nodded, and we moved on. That, too, was peace. Sometimes people ask me now, friends, students, younger women trying to find their place in boardrooms built by men like Julian, "How do you know when you've won?" And I always smile. Because here's the secret. You don't hear it when it happens. It's not a shout. It's not even a whisper. It's a lack of fear, of explaining, of asking to exist. That's how you know. Because one day you'll walk into a room that once made you shrink, and you won't feel small anymore. Not because the room changed, but because you finally stopped trying to fit. You chose to fill, and they noticed, even if they never said a word. Especially then, because silence in that kind of room is the loudest applause you'll ever hear. I sat once more on that same park bench near the river, same coffee, same breeze, but I was different now, not climbing, not running, not proving, just breathing, just being, and that, at last, was everything I had ever wanted. If this story moved you, If you've ever felt like the outsider at someone else's table or had to prove your worth in rooms that were never built for you, then let this ending be your beginning. Like, comment, or share if you believe power doesn't have to roar. Sometimes it just walks away and still wins.